So, quick review. Glycolysis generates 2 ATPs, produces pyruvate, which can generate 2 NADHs, acetyl coenzyme A, which is a 2-carbon molecule with coenzyme A attached to it, goes into Krebs cycle. Carbon dioxides come out, NADHs and FADH2s come out, and a little bit of ATP. And this one has a total yield of 36. So you see it does get calculated differently depending on who's doing the calculations. And notice they've decided that it's 3 ATPs for each one of those and 2 ATPs for each one of those. So they've basically taken the fudge factors away and said, nope, we're putting a number on it, doggone it. Here's why it's difficult to do the calculation. This is your electron transport chain. In the membrane in the mitochondria that goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, there's a lot of this. So the hydrogens are going through and then going through and then going through and going through and going through, and then electrons are being carried, producing eventually water, but producing ATPs as well. Another reminder, what actually feeds into the Krebs cycle is 2 carbons attached to coenzyme A. Why is that important? Because we can gain energy with compounds other than carbohydrates. Sugars go, and this isn't every single type of sugar. Some of the sugars go in a little bit differently and not necessarily through glycolysis. But from fats, glycerol can feed in this way, and sugars can feed in this way. Some sugars like fructose actually feed in over here. Remember that a fat is glycerol and fatty acids. Only 3 carbons in the glycerol, not a lot of energy there. Glycerol is typically recycled. Fatty acids, long chains of carbons. The carbons go in by 2, by 2, by 2. They get broken up, attached to coenzyme A 2 by 2 by 2, and go into the Krebs cycle. Proteins, broken into amino acids. You've got the nitrogen-containing amino group. That's not going into the Krebs cycle. That's got to be peeled off, and then the rest of the amino acid, the carbon amino acid parts, can be broken into 2 carbon molecules and fed into the system. So all of these things can be used for energy. Proteins, being very long chains, have a decent amount of energy in them. Fats, being very long strings, have a lot of energy in them. When you pull the amino group off of an amino acid, you wind up with NH3 or NH4 plus. It's ammonia or ammonium. Not a great thing in tissues. Ammonia is a little bit too reactive, and you can't just leave it hanging around. If you can get rid of it, fine. Animals that live in water can just release the ammonia into the water. And then there are organisms in the water that can take the ammonium ions and generate nitrites and nitrates and basically set up the nitrogen cycle that feeds back into plants and is used by them to produce amino acids and produce their proteins. So the release of ammonia is important. But if you're circulating your waste materials and you're flushing them out and hanging on to that for a while to release them so you're not leaving a dribble behind you everywhere you go. So largely for land animals, this isn't your preferred waste. You need to process it a little so it's not so toxic. The other issue that land animals wind up with is that in order to be on land, most of them have developed eggs that can develop in the air without drying out in the meantime. We talked about amniotic eggs in the vertebrates, but also insects and spiders and land arthropods. Not so much the mollusks who tend to lay their eggs where it's fairly wet. But the embryo is going to generate nitrogenous waste. It's going to generate ammonia. And it would build up to toxic levels if it was left as ammonia. So most land animals that lay eggs process the ammonia to uric acid. Is that the molecules? It shows you the molecules in the book if you're curious. Uric acid is a double ring. Each ring has, or actually the two rings together have 4 nitrogens on them. So they're pretty effective at getting rid of it. Now, some animals produce a 2 nitrogen molecule called urea. That's what we do. But we don't produce eggs. Platypus does. Platypus produces uric acid. Platypus is a mammal, but it produces uric acid waste. We produce urea because it's a little bit more soluble than uric acid, so it's easier to circulate. It's a little bit more toxic than uric acid, but we're getting rid of it pretty quickly anyway. We're flushing it out through our kidneys. The only other major group that produces urea that I'm aware of are I was going to say the sharks. I don't know whether it's all cartilaginous fish or not, but urea increases buoyancy. And so they actually do retain and store urea in special parts of their liver to give them the buoyancy that bony fish have with a gas-filled swim bladder. Is that bony fish can match their overall density to match the density of the water around them, right? Deeper is more dense. Sharks can't match the density of the water around them, but they can make themselves a little bit more buoyant by retaining urea. So it's not a waste thing. But those are all the 3 different major types of nitrogenous wastes. The last thing I want to talk about so you're minding your own business and suddenly you're cast into a life-threatening situation where the best option is to run like hell. So your muscles are working, skeletal muscles. And you're breathing really hard and you're pumping blood really fast, but you can't quite get enough oxygen to your muscles to give them all the energy that they need. And it's probably a pretty bad idea for your skeletal muscles to go, time out, time out, time out. I gotta let the blood catch up, the oxygen level catch up to our needs. So skeletal muscles will do this. Other cells in your body will not do this most of the time. Talk about that in a second. But your skeletal muscles can go into oxygen debt, which means they run the anaerobic stage and get that little bit of energy from the anaerobic stage and produce lactic acid. Remember that arrow from pyruvate that went to lactic acid? It produces lactic acid, which can be reconverted into pyruvate and fed back into the aerobic stage. But it gives you additional energy that you wouldn't have otherwise, but you have to eventually pay off that lactate by feeding it into the aerobic system. So you're building up an oxygen debt. So if you manage to run away from the danger, wherever you're gonna settle, you're gonna be paying the debt off for a while. Now, I mentioned there are, typically those are the only cells that can do that, but it is part of your genetic bag of tricks. As tumors grow, just bags of cells that divide and divide and divide and divide, masses of cells. Well, they're surrounded by blood vessels, but the bigger they get, the farther from the blood vessels' oxygen supply the central cells in a tumor are. And they get very oxygen starved. Now tumors, because they're damaged cells and they're turning genes on and turning genes off and killing themselves most of the time, but occasionally activating genes that are useful to them as the little clusters of parasitic cells that they are. Sometimes the tumors will turn on and release a signaling protein that says, nearby blood vessels, you need to invade and give us some oxygen and nutrients. That's what a chemical that's released while you're growing or while you're an embryo. As adults, we stop doing that. But it's still in there as our potential bag of tricks. And some tumors do that. And blood vessels invade the tumor and they keep the tumor alive. Some tumors, or tumors that have been treated with a chemotherapy that counteracts that signal, they can turn on the oxygen debt system and get by in a very low oxygen environment. Is that the ones that are very middle of the tumor are not, I mean, their activity levels go down, they're not reproducing that fast. The ones on the outside are reproducing. And it's only a real problem when they start to turn on the pseudopod genes and start wandering away. But oxygen debt is something that's skeletal muscle, it's built into skeletal muscle, not built into the other muscles, not built into the other tissues. If we turn off the oxygen to your other tissues, the whole system grinds to a halt and the cells eventually die. Okay, that's it for that chapter. This was a short video.